After waiting for many years, the gambling white paper has finally been published. And here it is, all 268 pages of it. And it's been a pretty laborious task reading over this over the past couple of hours, and I might miss some points because it's so long, but I feel like I'm going to present the most important points in this video from the Gambling Review. The main headline from the paper, of course, is about financial checks on users that lose over £1,000 in a 24-hour period or lose £2,000 over a 90-day period. I'm going to break down exactly what that means in this video. I mean, at the start of the white paper, it really does seem that the government went into this review with good intentions. As we see here on page 1, we need to make sure that we have the right balance between consumer freedoms and choice on the one hand, and protection from harm on the other. And also expressing that people should be free to spend their money how they wish to on page 39. But those well-intentioned words appear to be meaningless when we go on to see what the government actually propose throughout the rest of the paper. Because for as much as the government want to find the right balance between protecting people from harm and also controlling people who aren't in harm, as much as they make that claim, it's funny to see that they spend 4 pages talking about the gambling related harm and only 1 page actually talking about the benefits of gambling. So in that case, it isn't very balanced. People could say this is because the harms related to gambling significantly outweigh the positives to gambling. And depending on where you get your news from, you might think the UK is full of gambling addicts, because some news outlets really do push an agenda that the gambling issue is much bigger than it actually is. And this paper right here actually provides a lot of data about how significant the problem gambling issue really is. Figure 3 shows that over the past 20 years, problem gambling pretty consistently affects less than 1% of the UK adult population, peaking at about 1.2% in the year 2010. And gladly, recent signs indicate that the problem gambling rates are declining. Data from the Gambling Commission showed that problem gambling only affected 0.2% of the population in 2022. Compare that value to the 44% of the adult population who did some form of gambling in 2022. It's clear to see that the issue of problem gambling isn't as big as some news outlets make you believe that it is. However, although less than 1% of the population doesn't sound like that much, it is not acceptable to not help these people. We must do all that we can do where we can. The government estimates that this translates to approximately 300,000 problem gamblers, with another 1.8 million people potentially at risk. Plus, there are the people who are indirectly harmed by problem gambling, such as the partners or the parents of problem gamblers. So this is a very serious issue which we all really want to solve. But how much should the 44% of people who gamble in the UK be restricted in order to help the 0.2% of problem gamblers? Well, this is a very interesting philosophical question, and the government answer to this question appears to be, well, they should be restricted quite a bit. So what are the proposed restrictions? On page 4 of the white paper, it states, we propose these should take place at £125 net loss within a month or £500 within a year. Second, at higher levels of spend, which may indicate harmful binge gambling or sustained unaffordable losses, we propose thresholds of £1,000 net losses within 24 hours or £2,000 within 90 days. One very important caveat on page 42 is that the net loss does in fact refer to money deposited to the operator and not money lost from restaked winners, which was something I was really concerned about when I first saw these figures, because even very profitable gamblers can lose much more than £1,000 within 24 hours, so at least it refers to deposited money rather than the money already existing in your account. What do these affordability checks entail? Well, at the moderate level, the level of £125 net loss within a month or £500 within a year, it appears that automatic checks will take place which will supposedly be frictionless for the customer. Who decides how frictionless is defined? Well, you guessed it, it is of course the bookmaker. Just think about that for a second. The government doesn't trust you to lose £500 over the course of the year. That's less than £2 per day. The real pain starts if you're at the £1,000 loss over 24 hours or the £2,000 loss over 90 days criteria. Then the affordability checks become much more intrusive. How will these affordability checks be carried out, you may ask? Well, we find out right here on page 44. While the government accepts the chilling effect asking customers to provide bank documents can have, and also acknowledge that up to 90% of customers won't provide bank statements and instead will gamble elsewhere, including illegally on the black market, it looks like the government is going to completely reject those very logical reasons and customers will have to provide bank statements to the bookmakers. How rather infuriating. The most annoying thing about these affordability checks is just how unnecessary they actually seem to be. In the white paper, the government provide detailed statistics about winners and losers for gambling. It's been found that 21% of accounts are profitable each year, 60% of accounts lose less than £200 per year. So just think about that for a second. In total, 81% of gambling accounts in the UK are either profitable or lose no more than £200 per year. £200 per year is like 50p per day. It's almost impossible to compare that to any everyday item because there's almost nothing that is as cheap as 50p anymore. You can't even have half a bottle of milk for 50p per day. And yet, 81% of all customers who use gambling products are not losing that amount of money, or in fact are winning customers. In all fairness, the problem arises with a minority of customers who lose a substantial amount of money. About 6% of customers lose £1,000 or more each year through gambling, as can be seen in figure 5. And normally when I'm talking about this topic, it's very easy to make the cliched point that gambling is far more restricted than other forms of more damaging leisure activities, for example, drinking alcohol. But I don't even need to make that cliched point here because the government essentially does it for me in their white paper. On page 35 they state 13% of customers lost between £200 and £1,000, 5% lost between £1,000 and £5,000 and 1% lost more than £5,000. This suggests most customers do not spend above levels which would be usual in other leisure sectors, i.e. going out drinking. Then the government go on to make a great point against restrictions in general. That just because 1% of customers lose more than £5,000 a year, it doesn't mean that these users can't afford to take the losses. Some clearly can't afford to lose, but if a millionaire was to lose over £5,000 over the course of the year, that user is probably not even going to bat an eyelid about losing that little money relative to how much money they have. These restrictions are infuriating, especially as the government say on page 40, given that most gamblers are not spending more than they can afford or otherwise experiencing harm. So how does the government decide who can actually afford these big losses and who is actually a problem gambler and needs protecting? Well, the funny thing is, and by funny thing I of course mean absolutely terrifying thing, is that the government are leaving this in the capable hands of the bookmaker to decide on a case-by-case basis who is at risk and who can actually afford to take these losses. But as the government acknowledge on page 35, operator revenue is predominantly derived from a relatively small cohort of high-spending customers. There is a clear conflict of interest here. If it's up to the bookmaker, why would the bookmaker want to ban problem gamblers if they make up a massive portion of their revenue? Clearly, the incentive for the bookmaker isn't to ban them users, it is to ban people who are winning on the platform, to state restrict them, to give them affordability checks, because they want to get rid of them off their platform because they are losing money to them. The customer is taking money off the bookmaker. And let's talk about winners for a moment, because I was actually pleasantly surprised that the white paper even touched the subject of winning at gambling, because most people assume that you just can't win from gambling. And to my surprise, on page 61, the government make plenty of points for why restricting winners is a bad thing. The practice of not accepting bets from those who routinely beat the book has become far more sophisticated in the digital age. Many online operators now use data-driven consumer profiling tools to identify and restrict accounts which may not be profitable to serve, irrespective of whether this is resulting from shrewd bets or suspected cheating, insider knowledge or fraud. Normally, these restrictions are in the form of staking factor restrictions, which limit the maximum amount a customer can wager. Some viewed this practice as unfair towards successful bettors, and raised concerns that it runs contrary to the licensing objective that gambling should be fair and open. and therefore contributes to the overall low public confidence in fairness and trustworthiness of British gambling. Some specifically highlighted that restrictions could drive individuals to gamble with unlicensed operators or to illegally use third-party accounts, for example in a family member's name. Some submissions provided evidence that only betting accounts were restricted because of the element of skill, whereas gaming accounts were typically left unrestricted because of the statistically guaranteed return to the operators. This was criticised as allowing gamblers to keep losing but never win. The government note that peer-to-peer betting exchanges, such as Betfair, remain available to restricted bettors, but respondents highlighted that exchange accounts can be charged with high commission on winnings, which was seen as particularly unfair given that operators do not assume liability for peer-to-peer bets. I mean, come on, if there was ever a few paragraphs to perfectly highlight why banning winners is a bad thing, the government have just provided us with it. So what is the government's response to this issue of restricting winning accounts? You guessed it, absolutely nothing. Stating bookmakers can't be expected to endlessly pay expert or even professional bettors, as this would inevitably increase the cost for all consumers, for instance through worse odds, and businesses may take commercial decisions providing they do not discriminate on the basis of a protected characteristic. Being a successful bettor is not a protected characteristic in discrimination law. I guess that conclusion was probably to be expected, in all honesty. One thing that I am glad that's come from this gambling white paper is that the government acknowledges on page 5 just how big of an issue online casinos are to this problem, as opposed to things like sports betting. The government are proposing the introduction of stake restrictions for online slots. Online slots, blackjack, roulette, really are the virus of the gambling world. No matter how hard you try to win on any of these games, it is literally impossible to make money. And these games are scientifically engineered to get vulnerable people addicted to them. And for as much as I am sympathetic for the personal freedom argument, in a case where the only two options are to either A, never play on these games and keep your money, or B, play on these games and lose all of your money to the casino, they are literally the only two possibilities. There is no other alternative. So given that, I would much rather it that the government push people towards option A rather than option B. It is devastatingly sad the amount of money wasted on the lottery, and especially things like scratch cards, slot machines and casino games, and state restrictions on these games seems like a good thing to me. I'm just relieved that there were no max bet restrictions proposed in this gambling paper. It was rumoured a few months ago that that might be the case, so I'm definitely glad that hasn't been put in place. There are plenty more things to be concerned about reading over this paper. For example, on page 5, the government are proposing that deposit limits are to be mandatory, or at the very least opt out rather than opt in, but those concerns are for another day. I was somewhat surprised how well researched a lot of the points were throughout this gambling paper, but as much as they were well researched, they have drawn the wrong conclusions from these data time and time again. And I understand why they do that to some extent. They're under so much pressure to help people suffering from problem gambling. And we all want to help people suffering from problem gambling. And I'm not sure what the solution is to actually help people. But one thing I am sure of is the proposed reforms in this white paper definitely won't help problem gamblers. So to conclude, what comes next? Well, the government hope to implement the reforms from this paper in the summer of 2024. But politics can be a slow game. And with an election coming in 2024 as well, an election that this government almost certainly are not going to win, it's definitely possible that this won't be a priority anytime soon. But either way, it's definitely not good news. But having said that, it also could have been a lot worse. Thank you for watching this video, especially for the people supporting me on Patreon. Your names are appearing on screen right now. If you do want to download and read the government's white paper yourself, all 200 odd pages of it, I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.